Back to 1950s America, a day where time slowed down. It was July 15th, 1954, a Thursday. Nothing remarkable on paper, but the kind of day that sticks to the back of your mind. Not because of what happened, but because of how nothing rushed. Maplewood, Illinois, didn't care much for calendars. It was the sort of town where news still traveled by word of mouth and front porch, where people still waved even if they didn't remember your name, and where the only real traffic light blinked amber more often than red or green. That Thursday, the morning sun was slow to climb past the low hills behind Mr. Tomlinson's dairy barn. Dew still clung to the grass as the first mail truck rolled down Main Street at exactly 7:03 a.m., driven by old Walter, who'd been delivering letters longer than most folks in town had been alive. Inside the corner diner, Ruby's place, the coffee was already on. Ruby herself had been up since 5, her hair pinned high, apron already dusted with flour from the first batch of biscuits. The radio behind the counter hummed out soft doo-wop and Bing Crosby, cutting through the clink of porcelain and the scrape of boots on tile. At booth number 2 sat Mr. Harold Reeve, age 76, retired railroad conductor and unofficial mayor of Morning Opinions. He always ordered the same thing: black coffee, 2 eggs over medium, no toast, because toast is a distraction, he claimed. Outside, a boy with freckles the size of nickels sat on the curb with his dog, pretending to smoke a candy cigarette while watching cars go by. He counted every Ford and Chevy like they were rare birds, scribbling tally marks in a notebook older than he was. Across the street, Mrs. Eliza Winslow was hanging laundry on a line, humming a hymn no one had sung in church since the war ended. Her hands moved slowly, not from age, but from memory. Muscle memory, yes, but also heart memory, the kind you carry from a life of repetition, of care, of waiting. Maplewood was a quiet place, but it wasn't sleepy. It was alive in a way that buzzed just beneath the noise. You had to lean in to hear it. The click of the typewriter at the Gazette office, the slam of a screen door 3 houses down, the hush of a sigh from someone reading a letter twice just to feel closer to a name. And on that particular Thursday, under the unhurried sky and between the spoken silences, something subtle stirred, not loud, not dramatic, but enough to remind the people of Maplewood that some days don't need to change everything to matter. Some just need to be remembered. At 7:10 a.m., the chime above Ruby's diner door gave a soft, cheerful jingle, the kind of sound that belonged in cartoons or memory. In stepped Deputy Tom Granger, his sheriff's badge slightly askew, and his smile already halfway to a laugh. "Morning, Ruby," he said, removing his hat and brushing imaginary dust from it. "Smells like cinnamon. Am I early enough for the second batch?" Ruby didn't look up from the counter. She was kneading dough, her forearms steady like someone who had lifted heavier burdens than flour. "You're late, Tommy," she replied, "but lucky. Saved you a pecan bun. First come, first kept." Tom slid into the booth across from Harold Reeve, who gave him a glance over the rim of his mug. "Still wearing that badge like it means something," Harold muttered, not unkindly. Tom grinned. "Still drinking that coffee like it won't kill you." From the back, a soft clatter. Ruby's daughter June, barely 16 and already tired of small towns, was dropping silverware into rolled napkins. She hummed under her breath, a tune from the radio, but slower, like she was stretching it into something sweeter. She never smiled at customers, but she always brought cream without being asked. Across the street, the barber shop opened its blinds. The glass shimmered with sun, revealing 2 figures inside: Carmine, the barber, and little Emmett Weaver, fidgeting in the chair while his mother spoke with exaggerated patience. The boy's legs swung like pendulums, his eyes watching the scissors like they might bite. Down at the gas station, Charlie Green waved off an early customer. "Ain't open till 8, Bob," he shouted, hands slick with oil from yesterday's job. Bob, unfazed, gave a 1-finger wave, not rude, just resigned, and kept on walking toward the post office. At the bakery next to Ruby's, someone turned the sign to "Open," and the smell of sourdough drifted out onto the sidewalk like a whisper that pulled people in. And still, no one rushed. Because in Maplewood, morning wasn't a time. It was a sequence. By 7:30, the sounds had settled into rhythm. Forks clinked, truck engines idled, dogs barked and gave up quickly. The sun was higher now, glinting off Mr. Emerson's hardware shop window, where a tiny American flag swayed behind the glass. He'd hung it there on VJ Day and never taken it down. Even the pigeons were regulars, perched on the drugstore's ledge like old men watching the world pass slower than they remembered. Ben Carter, the freckled boy with the candy cigarette, finally stood up. His dog, a mutt named Lyle with one floppy ear and a limp from chasing something he shouldn't have, trotted beside him as they made their way down Main Street. They paused in front of the bookshop, where Mrs. Delilah Ferguson was unlocking the door. "You open yet?" Ben asked. Delilah smiled. "Open enough." Inside, the air was cool and smelled like paper and dust and dreams. Ben made a beeline for the illustrated westerns. He couldn't read too fast, but he loved the pictures. Lyle flopped down near the counter, tail thumping once. Delilah poured herself tea. "Your mama's coming in later?" Ben shrugged. "She's working early at the cannery." Delilah nodded. That was all she needed to know. By 8:00 the church bell chimed, not because there was service, but because Mrs. Tally James believed Maplewood deserved a bell every morning, even if God wasn't watching. At 8:05 the train passed through the edge of town. Just one, slow and stubborn. It didn't stop anymore, but people still looked up when it groaned past, some with memories, some with longing. Back at the diner, the morning rush began its decline. Regulars drifted out with bellies full and shoulders eased. A few left dimes under saucers. One man left a single folded note. "Ruby, that coffee tastes like forgiveness. Don't ask me why." She didn't. Then at 8:42, something unusual happened. A stranger arrived. He stepped off a Greyhound bus that wasn't supposed to stop. He wore a light brown suit, too warm for summer, and carried a briefcase that looked like it had crossed time zones. His shoes were polished, but his tie was crooked, like he'd dressed in a hurry and regretted it halfway. Ruby watched him from the window as he stood in front of the diner, uncertain. Tom Granger, sipping his second coffee, narrowed his eyes slightly, not suspiciously, just curiously, because in Maplewood, strangers didn't happen. The man entered the diner. The bell jingled. Time didn't stop, but it did pause long enough for every head to lift. "Morning," the man said. His voice was calm, but his eyes darted from face to face. "Do you serve breakfast this late?" Ruby wiped her hands and nodded. "We serve it as long as people keep eating it." He smiled, not with his mouth, but with his shoulders, like something released inside him. "Then I'll take a table, and maybe the house special." "You'll want booth 3, Ruby said, nodding toward the corner seat. "And the house special is just food made with care. Hope that's not a disappointment." "It's exactly what I need," he replied. As he sat, Harold leaned toward Tom and whispered, "You reckon he's lost or looking?" Tom tilted his head. "Or maybe he's just stopping to remember something." By 11:55 a.m., the light in Maplewood had shifted, no longer golden but soft, like sunlight filtered through linen. Cicadas stirred in the distance, and shadows from the oak trees stretched across the sidewalk like fingers reaching for something they'd never quite grasp. At Ruby's diner, the lunch crowd was a slow-moving river. Farmers in worn overalls, a schoolteacher on her summer break, and 2 women from the sewing guild took their usual spots. The sound of cutlery and conversation filled the space, not loud but full. The stranger in booth 3 hadn't left. He'd finished his eggs and toast, but now sat quietly with a second cup of coffee, staring out the window as if it might answer a question he hadn't asked out loud. Ruby, polishing glasses behind the counter, kept one eye on him. Not with suspicion, she wasn't that kind, but with that quiet curiosity only small towns know how to wear well. Like a coat that isn't warm, but always fits. "What's your name, friend?" she finally asked, wiping her hands on a cloth and walking over. The man looked up, blinked as if waking from a far-off memory. "Matthew," he said. "Matt Delaney. You passing through?" He hesitated. "You could say that. though this town wasn't on my list. The bus broke down 2 miles back. Ruby nodded. Funny how life does that. Break something so you'll sit still. Matt smiled, just barely. Is that what this town is? Stillness? Ruby leaned on the counter, her voice gentle. It's what's left, after the noise goes home. At precisely 12:07 p.m., the post office bell rang, 3 quick chimes. It meant Mrs. Kingsley had received a parcel from her daughter in Omaha. Everyone knew the code. The town had its own unspoken Morse. Carmine the barber crossed the street with a bag of sandwiches, one of which he handed to Emmett, the boy from the morning haircut, who now sat on the bench outside the general store with a comic book in his lap. Down near the park, Ben Carter had taken to skipping rocks with Lyle. The boy's laughter echoed off the water like a bell no one had rung in years. The gas station played a Glenn Miller tune from a radio near the open bay door. Charlie Green worked beneath a '57 Chevy, singing half the lyrics and humming the rest. Life wasn't still. It was slow-moving, like honey in winter, or stories told by candlelight, and in that pace, something sacred lived. Matt Delaney stepped outside the diner around 12:20. He squinted into the sun, then crossed the street and stood in front of the town square. It was modest, just a stone circle with a bench and a statue of someone no one really remembered, but whom everyone respected. He sat. After a moment, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a photograph. Worn, creased at the edges, a black and white image of 2 children on a swing, one laughing, the other mid-air. The background looked familiar, very familiar. Ruby, having stepped out with a glass of iced tea for herself, noticed the photo from across the street. Her eyes narrowed, just for a second. She crossed, stood quietly behind the bench. "That photo," she said. "That's Maplewood Park." Matt turned. "Yes, taken in 1939, I think. My brother and I." Ruby tilted her head. "Then you've been here before?" He nodded. "We spent a summer here. My aunt owned the flower shop, Ferguson's Florals." Ruby sat beside him. "That shop's a bakery now. Best rye bread this side of St. Louis." Matt smiled. "We built a fort in the woods behind the church, spent every afternoon covered in mud. I remember thinking the world ended at the edge of this town." Ruby looked out over the street. "For some of us, it still does." There was a pause, soft, not awkward. "I don't know why I never came back," Matt said, folding the photo. "I always meant to." Ruby looked at him then, not the man he was, but the boy he'd been. "Some places don't call you back, they just wait." Back at the diner, June was wiping down booth 3. She paused when she saw the note under the sugar jar. "This town tastes like memory. Thank you, M.D." She smiled, folded it once, and slipped it into the tin box where they kept other forgotten things: buttons, expired coupons, and notes from customers who'd once fallen in love at table 6. At 12:45 p.m., the sun crested high. In most towns, that meant traffic, urgency, things to do. In Maplewood, it meant nap time for some, front porch for others, and one last cup of tea for those in between. Even the breeze slowed. And across town, in quiet corners, something rare was happening. People were remembering things they didn't know they'd forgotten. Some things don't fade, they settle. By 3:10 p.m., the shadows of Maplewood had stretched long enough to cross entire porches. The heat had softened, still present, but gentle, like an old friend who stayed too long and finally stood up to leave. At Ruby's diner, the last lunch plates had been cleared, and the kitchen was silent, save for the hum of the refrigerator and the slow drip of a leaking faucet. June had disappeared upstairs to nap, claiming she needed to read a book, but Ruby knew the truth, the kind of sleep only sunlight could coax. Outside, on the bench beneath the drugstore awning, Mr. Harold Reeve sat with his hat tipped forward and a book in his lap he hadn't touched in hours. He wasn't reading. He was remembering the train lines, the leather seats, the sound of a whistle at dusk, remembering a woman with red gloves who once sat beside him from Kansas City to Omaha and never said a word, but whose presence had changed him in some subtle, permanent way. Across the street, the church bells rang 3 times, just as they always did, not for any religious reason, but because old habits don't ask permission to continue. Matt Delaney stood near the edge of Maplewood Park now, leaning against the same oak tree from the photo in his coat pocket. It was taller now, wiser maybe. The bark gnarled in ways it hadn't been when he and his brother Jack had carved their initials into it with a pocket knife bought for 50 cents at a county fair. He found the letters, faint, nearly lost in the folds of time, but still there. M+J, 1939. He ran his fingers over the groove. A smile ghosted his lips. Behind him, the sound of children. Ben Carter had returned, now joined by 2 friends and a game of marbles that had turned into a debate about who could skip the most rocks. Lyle barked once and then laid down again, tail thudding against the dirt. Matt turned toward the noise and watched quietly. Their laughter made something in his chest shift, like a window opening to let in a breeze he hadn't realized he'd missed. He checked his watch. The next bus wouldn't come until nearly 5, plenty of time to stay lost a little longer. At the edge of town, Delilah Ferguson, the bookstore owner, sat behind her desk with a knitting project she'd abandoned years ago. She wasn't sure why she picked it up again today. Maybe because the air had the smell of old summers. Or maybe because someone had come into her store that morning and smiled the same way her brother used to before he left for the war and never came back. She hummed the same tune June had been humming in the diner earlier. Funny how songs traveled, even without radios. By 4:00, Maplewood entered what Ruby called the quiet stretch. It was the hour when even the bees took a breath, when phone calls slowed, when hands were still but minds were busy, when people didn't talk unless they had something worth saying. And even then, they waited. Ruby found herself wiping down the counter for the 3rd time. There was nothing on it, just memory. Tom Granger stepped in again, this time without his badge. Just a man now, just Tom. He sat on a stool. "Still open?" he asked. Ruby poured him iced tea. "Always." They didn't speak for a while. Finally he said, "You ever feel like you're forgetting something you used to know?" Ruby looked up. "Every day." He nodded. "Me too." Then silence. The safe kind. At 4:45, Matt returned to the square with a small paper bag in hand. Inside was a piece of pecan pie from the bakery and a book of poetry he hadn't intended to buy, but Delilah had insisted. "If you're going to sit in silence, might as well let someone else say something worth hearing." He sat on the same bench from earlier. The same statue watched over him. The same breeze moved through the same trees, but it felt different now, softer, like the town had accepted him, not as one of their own, but as someone who remembered how to listen. And at 4:58, as the bus engine rumbled into earshot from 2 streets over, Matt looked down at his hands and realized they were no longer trembling. He stood, dusted his slacks, and walked toward the stop. But halfway there, he paused, turned, and looked back, at the diner, at the trees, at the sidewalk cracks filled with moss, at the people who never once asked him where he came from or what he wanted, only if he needed anything. He turned toward Ruby's window. She waved once. He nodded. The bus arrived. The doors opened. He stepped in. But as the engine growled and the town slipped behind the windows like a dream dissolving at dawn, Matt Delaney didn't feel like he was leaving. He felt like he was carrying something with him, something real, something that didn't belong to him but was offered freely, stillness. By 6:05 p.m., Maplewood returned to its favorite pace, almost still, like the moment before a song ends and no one wants to move. The diner lights dimmed to golden. Ruby placed the chairs upside down on the tables, her arms moving slower now, not from fatigue, but from intention. June had come back down, her hair tousled from sleep, and was now sweeping flour from corners no one ever saw, but Ruby always noticed. Across town, the last customer left Carmine's barber shop with a fresh trim and a newspaper tucked under his arm. Carmine locked the door, turned the sign to "closed," and stood a moment, staring into the street, like it might say something if he waited long enough. At the park, the marbles game had ended. The kids had scattered, trailing dust and candy wrappers. Only Ben and Lyle remained. The boy sat beneath the swing set, his knees pulled to his chest, humming something he didn't realize was the same tune his mother sang when she thought he was asleep. Lyle yawned, curled beside him, and the two of them watched the sky shift from soft blue to bruised lavender. Somewhere, an old record was playing. Not loud, but just enough that the notes floated between trees like fireflies. Inside the bookstore, Delilah closed her ledger and lit a candle she didn't need. The warm flicker danced against the spines of books older than most people in town. She traced her finger down the front of the poetry volume she'd sold earlier. "The heart does not forget. It whispers," the dedication read. She smiled. Ruby stood outside her diner now, arms folded, apron stained with the dust of a day that meant nothing and everything all at once. She looked toward the old oak tree in the distance, the one she and her brother had once climbed as children, the one she later brought her daughter to on Sunday afternoons. She thought of the man from booth 3, of how he never said much, but somehow made the air around him gentler just by sitting still. Tom Granger passed by, tipped his hat. Ruby nodded. No words needed, because in Maplewood, what mattered most was often left unsaid. Somewhere along Route 27, a Greyhound bus rolled quietly past fields of corn and roads no one paved anymore. Inside, Matt Delaney leaned against the window, the book of poetry unopened in his lap, the photo of the swing tree now tucked inside its cover. He didn't know where he was going exactly, but for the first time in a long while, he wasn't looking for a destination. He was remembering a feeling, the feeling of a place that didn't try to fix him, or judge him, or even ask about him. It simply let him exist. And in that space, in that gentle allowance, he found something he hadn't known he'd lost. Peace. You might never visit Maplewood, might never walk its sidewalks or taste Ruby's pie. But maybe, just maybe, you've known a place like it. A porch where stories lived longer than the people who told them. A summer day that stretched without hurry. A silence that held you like an old friend. Those places still exist, not always on maps, but in memory. And when the world feels too loud, too fast, too sharp, you can return, not to a town, but to a feeling, to a Thursday that never rushed.